is Henry Emily, at least in the FNAF games, unequivocally a good man? I'm going to bet that most of you will say that yes, he is. And if not, then at least you may remember a time when you did think of him as nothing but good. After all, why wouldn't you? FFPS, the game where he is both introduced and killed off, never gives you any reason to think otherwise, right? He's an honest man devoted to fixing the mistakes of his past, mistakes that took away his daughter's life among many others. He is the one to ultimately end William's reign of terror, giving the souls of his victims rest, bringing closure to the agony of Freddy's, at least for a while. Except when you take a step back and look beyond the curtain, beyond the smoke of his magnum opus and the eloquence of his eulogy to the franchise he helped create, when you assess his actions objectively, you may find he is not quite what the story wants you to believe he is. You may find someone far more questionable, someone his writer fails to explore with the depth he required, and thus someone whose actions create a strange dissonance between the actual events and what the narrative wants us to believe. I am not here to argue Henry is outright evil, he isn't. However, I firmly believe the story does its audience a disservice by essentially lying just to make Henry easier to root for, at the cost of creating a black mark in what many consider to be an otherwise perfect ending. And to clarify, I don't mean that the story lies in a cheeky theory-bait way. This isn't a theory video, it's a character analysis. Because I don't believe the story lies intentionally, but rather that the lie comes from poor writing. How? Well, let me explain. Let's start by looking at everything Henry has done in the games. The books are a different beast, and while I am going to reference them later, I am mainly talking about the Henry in the games who has done different things and thus is arguably a different character. However, there are things that stay the same in both continuities. Henry builds up Fredbear's with the help of William Afton, who later murders Henry's daughter, Charlie. From here in the games, Henry steps away from Freddy's, perhaps making the animatronics still, but as Fungi implies in FNAF 2, by 87 the company has trouble contacting the original owner of Fredbear's, which likely means both William and Henry. He doesn't seem to do anything for 30 years, but we know he develops some suicidal tendencies.
I could make myself sleep, but not yet.
Which is only corroborated by the fact that the Henry from the Silver Eyes does commit suicide, undeniably a tragedy. However, in the games, he lives to see Fazbear's Frights open. He either is or isn't the one to burn down that place, but he absolutely is the one to burn down the FFPS pizzeria. After all, he's the one who sets up the whole thing, creating paragraph 4 to establish the idea of getting them all together by Saturday, hiring Michael Afton to do the dirty work, and finally burning it all in the end. You see, Henry's found this blueprint of the scooper which mentions there is a possibility overheating neutralizes the effects of Remnant permanently, and having nothing left, Henry clings to this possibility like a lifeline. He probably didn't think this one through too much, or test it at all, since it's pretty clear he didn't destroy the Remnant like he hoped. You see, even ignoring the fact that the blueprints specifically call out that this is only a possibility, neutralizing the effects and destroying Remnant may mean two different things. I'll leave a theory on screen describing why Henry's plan seems to have failed, because it's overall not too important for the current discussion, so read it if you want. I say it's not important because even if Henry doesn't fully understand Remnant, that still doesn't give us much insight into his actual character or his morality. He just made a mistake, right? Well, that's true in that case, but the devil's in the details, and Henry's devils are large enough to fill an entire pit in hell. For one, his longest lasting crime is his inaction and negligence. Now, I'm not going to blame a man who just lost his daughter for finding himself consumed by grief and in no condition to help as more and more children go missing. However, it is undeniable that his abandonment of Freddy's is part of the reason William was able to inflict as much suffering as he did. Henry says as much in FFPS's insanity ending.
It's only now that I understand the depth of the depravity of this creature, this monster that I unwillingly helped to create.
The children were arguably hard to save, since even the toy's security features didn't do much to help, but they're far from the only victims of Henry's negligence. Remember all the night guards who died because Freddy's would rather sweep their deaths under the rug than address the issue directly? Something which happened often enough for the 93's pizzeria to have entire protocols for what happens when one of them dies? arguably Henry failing to take responsibility for his business is part of the reason this happened. However, this is all acknowledged to some extent in the game itself. Henry considers it a horrible mistake on his part, and part of the reason he created the final pizzeria was to seek redemption for it. And if it hadn't failed, then he really would have redeemed himself, right? Except this plan too had some questionable aspects, and arguably what Henry is willing to do to complete his magnum opus is worse than his inaction before, because this time he is willingly allowing the possible death of the people he hires. Keep in mind, Henry didn't know Michael Afton would be the one to take up the management position of the final pizzeria.
And to you, my brave volunteer, who somehow found this job listing not intended for you.
So he was extremely lucky that the person who got the job was likely the most experienced night guard in Freddy's history, as opposed to some random schmuck who would have been torn apart the moment they tried to survive a single night with a spiteful animatronic chasing them down. It gets especially bad in the salvage sections, where Henry, instead of doing the hard part himself, leaves this random person in front of a violent, murderous monster with only a taser to defend themselves, and with instructions not to overuse it, no less. And it's not like Henry didn't take this into account either, because he's also willing to throw the employee into the psych ward to ruin their lives if they ever discover the secret blueprints and audio of the insanity ending. Let me repeat. If an employee accidentally stumbled onto what is generally pretty innocent information, they would have their lives ruined in service of Henry's plan. But hold on, because if that wasn't enough, there's still more. And his treatment of Michael and Charlie in FFPS might just be the most perturbing thing yet. I've already explained all the danger Michael had to endure just because Henry, thought he wouldn't be able to handle it himself, but that's not the only thing. I want to remind you, there's a good 30 years between the closing of Freddy's and the opening of Frights, who is to say that Michael, who can evidently pass as human if he's able to get a show at Frights, hasn't revealed some semblance of a normal life. He may have a group of good friends, maybe married and or adopted kids, or had them, but I'm not sure I believe Michael reason. Heck, for all we know, he got so bored he started a YouTube channel. Am I Michael Afton? The point is, he could absolutely have plenty of reasons to live. And yet...
Although there was a way out planned for you, I have a feeling that's not what you want. I have a feeling that you are right where you want to be.
Henry projects his own suicidal ideation onto Michael. He believes that because he wants to move on, and Michael is similar to him in some aspects, then Michael must want to die as well. Suicidal tendencies are a complex and difficult topic to talk about, one that I do not have the expertise necessary to tackle properly. All I can really say is that there is never a valid reason to take one's own life, and a suicide is always a tragedy. However, what Henry does here, this projection, is not okay. Regardless of whether it's true or not, it's not his place to assume how Michael feels about his own life. Especially when, as far as we know, Michael doesn't know where the exit is. Think about it, we play as Michael in the game, so presumably whatever he sees, we see. And we're never shown the supposed way out. As far as we know, if Michael wanted to get out, he wouldn't be able to, because Henry never tells him how to. Suddenly, I have a feeling you're right where you want to be takes on a much more sinister tone. And then... Lefty. We could discuss which of Henry's sins is the worst, but frankly, this thing is what really makes my blood boil. Because the blueprints for Lefty are, frankly, horrifying. First, let's keep in mind that Charlie, at this point in the timeline, is most likely not dangerous. She shows up in Fast First fights, but she doesn't attack Michael or even William. This is because, as implied in this UCN line,
I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way.
Revenge, at one point or another, stopped being Charlie's primary goal. Presumably, by the time Fights opens at least, she is more focused on freeing the children's soul than getting back at William. If she wishes him any form of harm, it's only because she believes that will help the others move on.
Seeing you powerless is like music to me.
and that means she won't mistakenly attack anyone under the belief they are William, like she was doing back in 87. Mind you, there's not much to base this interpretation on, but I find that the most sensible conclusion, considering the puppet's actions and words at this point in the timeline. Which leads us to Lefty. Lure, encapsulate, fuse, transport, extract. Note that, according to its blueprints, it is made by Fazbear Entertainment Inc. Not After Robotics like the Scooper, by Fazbear's, which means Henry must have had some influence in its design. Especially if he was keeping its purpose secret, which he likely was. There is no getting Henry out of this one. And what is this one exactly? Well, look at the rest of the blueprint. It already starts off dubious, mentioning a false sensory output to lure the puppet in, because if you're wondering, that is the hex code corresponding to the color of Charlie's bracelet in the security puppet minigame. It also uses Lullaby Index 01 to soothe it, presumably grandfather's clock as we hear in FNAF 2. And from FNAF 2, we know this influences the puppet's behavior. Charlie's mind is clouded when she hears this song, and presumably when she perceives the bracelet code as well. That's already worrying, and could explain why Charlie's behavior on Lefty is different from the one shown in FNAF 3. As the blueprint states, behavior upon suit seal is not guaranteed. But if you think that's innocent enough, the mask drops completely in the last of Lefty's protocols. Upon suit seal, provide steady voltage throughout. So, in case you forgot, as introduced in Sister Location and reiterated by all games following it, electric shocks are extremely painful to the animatronics, to the point where most of them shut down when they are subjected to electricity. Lefty is, in simple terms, a torture machine meant to subdue someone who at this point has nothing but good intentions. I know some later media has tried to gaslight us into thinking the puppet has control of Lefty, and may even be able to escape if she really wanted. But as presented in the blueprints, that's just impossible. If nothing else, the steady voltage should be stopping her entirely, since we see Lefty is affected by electricity in the salvage minigame. And if you somehow still don't think Charlie is in serious pain inside this thing, then her voice in UCN should be enough to convince you. Listen, I understand why Henry did this, because Henry presumably never sees the puppet in Fazbear's frights. He's probably still under the assumption she's the dangerous killer of night guards she was back in 87. Someone so aggressive even Fungi was scared of her. It's clear he didn't create Lefty with any malicious intent, seeing as he still definitively cares about his daughter.
I couldn't save you then, so let me save you now.
It all came down to an unfortunate misunderstanding, most likely. But that doesn't make it much better. He still absolutely hurt his daughter just as much as William hurt his own back at Circus Rental. But what really gets me about Lefty isn't so much that he exists, but that Henry seems to hold no remorse for it. He never apologizes for it, even as he proclaims his love for the daughter he tortured and is now burning alive. In fact, with this context, doesn't Henry come off as unhinged, almost? Think about it. A man at the end of his rope, so consumed by grief that he's one bad day away from doing something truly regrettable, stumbles upon a random blueprint which seems to give him a way out, a way to fix everything he helped destroy. He latches onto this, desperately, never even bothering to check if his newfound plan would work or not, just charging full steam ahead, because this one promise that there is a possibility overheating will nullify the effects permanently is the only thing he has left anymore. He is so desperate, in fact, that he sets up everything haphazardly, never bothering with proper protection for the employee he'll hire to do his dirty work. Because they're not important, they haven't suffered as much as Henry. Henry needs this to redeem himself. Who cares if a few random schmucks end up dead or in an asylum? They're not related to Freddy's, and Freddy's is the only thing that Henry has been able to think about since the death of Charlotte. And oh, Charlotte, poor Charlotte, twisted into a monster by the machinations of a demon. She needs to be saved, she needs her father. And don't worry, Henry will help you, Charlie, but she's dangerous. So Henry will build an animatronic for her, just like when she was alive. And well, those blueprints did mention electricity could keep the animatronics calm, so sure, electrocute her. It's a necessary evil. Why? Well, because Henry said so, and Henry is the ultimate authority, the voice of reason. He's good, he's benevolent, he can't do harm. Father knows best. So he brings them all together by doing what he's done for 40 years, basically nothing, and sets the place on fire. And oh, look at that! Michael's here! Henry knows how he feels. When his brother died in the shows of Fredbear, he must have felt just as awful and guilty as Henry did, shutting himself from the world until he had nothing left to lose. Surely this is his time to rest as well. Meanwhile, Michael is desperately trying to escape, because there's a lot of people he's met over the years that consider him a friend and at least deserve an explanation or a goodbye. But he can't get away. There was a way out planned for you, says Henry, and it comes off like a taunt. I have a feeling you're right where you want to, he continues. And it horrified Michael more than any animatronic ever did. Henry hears Elizabeth and Molten Freddy screaming, but that's fine. Everyone will find peace and he'll be reunited with Charlotte again. Charlie needs to get out. There are still spirits to save. Cassidy hasn't moved on. She has to leave, but she can't. She's in pain from the shocks and the fire, and her vision's going dark. Let me save you now, Henry says, as Charlie cries in horror and pain. All the while, William laughs, because he knows this won't work. He'll be stopped for a while, sure, but he knows he'll come back. He always does. The darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow Henry and the others, sure, those thorns on his side. But the devil will have to wait for him yet. Obviously, this isn't what Scott was going for. I don't think he has the writing ability to even try to pull off an unreliable narrator, especially because nothing about the way the games frame his actions ever makes him out to be one. And if anyone could have thought he was meant to be one, then the character encyclopedia calling him a voice of reason should dispel all those doubts. It's clear that Scott wanted Henry to just be a good guy, and didn't think about what his actions really entailed. And frankly, Henry probably should have just been a good guy. It works narratively, even if he does take away a speech that arguably should have been Michael's, and steals away Charlie's credit for freeing the children. But there were sacrifices made in favor of the gameplay that took away from Henry's character. Of course, you need the employee to be in danger, and you need the puppet to be dangerous in order to have, FNAF gameplay, and it's not like it's impossible to do this without ruining characters. For example, if Michael had been the one to set up the pizzeria, then the danger he faces is justified, because he's the one who put himself there. And, well, making Charlie dangerous was always going to be a bit difficult, but there were probably solutions for that too. And yet, Scott decided at the last moment that Henry had to be there because, well, he's in the books and we can't just write his character off in the games. So Scott tried to write him in, but to do that he had to make him feel important. And to do that, he only found a way of making these questionable actions part of his character. And so the biggest problem with Henry's character is finally unveiled. Regardless of any involvement in the books, Henry was ultimately introduced and killed off in one game, which makes him and his character feel rushed, especially since he's meant to be someone the player must trust unconditionally. There are several characters who had to be wrapped up in what Scott decided would be just one speech by one character, so that character has to be someone the audience can fully trust to say the right thing. That's why Henry never apologizes for Lefty, why his treatment of the volunteer is never addressed. Because if either of those happened, if Henry's actions were ever challenged, then he wouldn't be the unquestionable figure of truth and good Scott needed to make the ending what it was. And it's clear the narrative treats him differently as a result, when you consider the double standards it seems to have when dealing with Henry's crimes as opposed to anyone else's. What do I mean by this? Well, it almost feels like the narrative is more willing to forgive Henry for his actions than all other characters, as he doesn't face any consequences for them. Think about it. FNAF's narrative is defined by very real, very physical consequences for anyone who does something bad, sometimes even sprinkling in some irony for good measure. William kills kids and stuffs them in suits, then the kids scare him into putting on a suit, which kills him. Michael accidentally kills his brother, so he gets killed by his sister. Elizabeth betrays Michael, so she is betrayed by the bandmates she helped escape from rental. Charlie traps the kid's soul in animatronics, which, don't worry, I'll make a video about Charlie and I'll have words about to give gifts. So she forces herself to spend decades trapped in the puppet's body trying to free them, and then ends up trapped in another prison, Lefty. The missing children kill night guards, so their bodies are destroyed and they end up in Funtime Freddy, or Molten Freddy at least. I said the irony only applied to some of them, okay? Even all the way up to the Glamrocks being destroyed in Security Breach, as well as like half of all Phosphorus Frights and Tales stories. And to be clear, I am not arguing that all these people deserve what happened to them, or that they had it coming, or anything like that. No, FNAF's punishments are hardly ever fair. But that's not bad, it's just how the narrative is constructed. And I consider it to be pretty effective. This is because this type of punishment is FNAF's way of acknowledging a character's flaws and exploring them. Not to mention it adds to the horror of the narrative. Michael serves as an example of a time FNAF used physical consequences to their fullest extent. Again, I don't think he deserved to die for what he did to his brother, but his death does make his character better. We see his determination to, literally get up after death, a determination born from guilt and spite towards his father, which is reinforced in his dialogue and actions. All the while, he never seems too mad at Elizabeth, showing maturity, and even mentions his death as only a footnote, which may hint at self-loathing. This is all because the story wasn't afraid to make him struggle to get what he wants, which makes us want to root for him. But it also does it in a way that acknowledges his flaws, which helps make it feel sincere, and not like it's lying. You can't say the same about Henry, because the story never acknowledges most of the questionable stuff Henry does. That is the double standard of Henry's character. Sure, we're told he was sad about his inaction, but all the other stuff goes unsaid, because the story is too afraid, too hesitant to really challenge Henry's actions, and that makes his character confusing. And this ends up taking away from other characters too, and thus the story as a whole. Because Henry can never be wrong, what he said about Michael must be how Michael felt. Michael himself gets no input, which makes his conclusion to his character arc feel, inconclusive. Then, because Henry is unequivocal good, Charlie must be willing to instantly forgive the torture machine he stuck her in, so we never get to see how she actually feels about it all. Shouldn't Charlie at least, express that she was in pain inside of Lefty? Because since Henry gets the last word, we are led to assume that if Charlie and Henry reunite, then Charlie will just perfectly be able to forgive Henry for what he did to her, and just have this loving daughter and father relation that they lost so many years ago, when no, things will have absolutely changed. Charlie, despite not being as vengeful as the others, still has some sense of justice, and would want Henry to at least apologize to her. Listen, if you're gonna make Henry do the things he does, you have to make sure you address the ambiguity. The easiest way would be to present his actions neutrally and just allow the audience to decide how they feel about him. Because there are good things Henry does, of course there are. His plan was ultimately in good faith. There are valid reasons as to why he wouldn't put himself in danger if he's orchestrating the whole thing, and so why he needs to hire a volunteer. And maybe there just wasn't any way to make their job any safer. And then Charlie, again, that's just a misunderstanding. So if he acknowledged that he feels very sorry for doing this to her because he just thinks it's the safest for the employee, it would have made for an interesting topic of discussion if it had been presented neutrally. But the problem is that it's not presented neutrally, and that is the failing of the narrative. When you consider all that Henry has done, his final speech feels insincere. The story only wants you to hear of his compassion for Elizabeth and the children, of his hatred of William, of things that make him sympathetic. The music swells with triumph because the good guys have won, but also has melancholic undertones to further communicate Henry's pain. And that's ultimately why I think this is important. As I said before, the ending does work great if Henry is just good. He didn't need to be complicated. But he is, so when you don't address that, it creates a black mark on this otherwise spectacular ending. It makes what is already a difficult story to understand even more confusing. No wonder so many people are willing to take Henry's speech at face value. it just makes a better narrative at face value than it does when you actually think about it. But it is important to think about it, because at this point, the characters of FNAF are the ones who drive forward the series' themes and messages, so it should be questioned when one of these characters is presented in a completely disingenuous way. Okay, rant over. I hope you enjoyed this little breakdown of Henry's character, and even if you don't agree with me, at least you can understand where I'm coming from. This series has a lot of interesting characters, and the way they're written is very important to me. I hope you were able to take at least something from this little analysis, and that you're not too mad if I beat down on a character that you personally enjoy. And I also hope that if you know of any fanfiction where Michael and Charlie team up to grill Henry about all this, then you can send it to me so I can read it. Please? Alright. Thanks for watching.